faces in the room. Thanks for visiting us. We're here every week. I'm Jason Delborn. I'm in the faculty in Forestry and Environmental Resources and also one of the cluster faculty in GES. We always start with just some announcements about things that are happening this coming week that are of interest to this community. So what's going on? Yes, Fred.
So next week, on the 19th, we have a visitor, Dave Hawthorne from the University of Maryland, who is with the
Succinct.
It's a synthesis of socio-ecological or environmental analysis. It's an NSF center, and they do a lot of work on, mixing up social and natural sciences, and they have lots of money, and they sponsor postdocs and graduate students and meetings, and so Dave's interested in the potential for interactions with us, and not just in the GES program, but beyond that. So, and he happens to have been a master's student in entomology here many years ago. So he's going to come and he's going to give a seminar at 3:30 on Monday just about his entomology work, and then he's going to do the colloquium. But I sent out an announcement to some folks here about meeting with him either for lunch or other times for graduate students. So please get back to me, and we'll set up those appointments. Should be interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Another announcement. This isn't the right book, but this is the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. This past Sunday, I guess, and so I'm running a community discussion about the book at the Cameron Park Library at 7 p.m. On Wednesday. So if anybody wants to discuss Frankenstein, I just reread it this week, and so I'll lead a discussion of people from the community, so you're welcome as well.
Dr. Frankenstein just drive you crazy again?
What did you say?
He just complains all the time.
It is a hard book to get
through. Is it at 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock, yeah, at the Cameron Park Library. Anything else? Yes, Patty.
Let's see here, a few things. Tomorrow and Thursday we have the Ethics and Responsible Innovation in STEM workshop. It's full, so if you're not going, then sorry, you're not going. But we are gonna try to live stream the keynote and the discussion panels. So look on the website and you'll see the link. It's the same link that you would use to access the live streamed colloquium. In case you're unaware, we are live streaming colloquium. And then also Thursday afternoon we have Jill Kunert from Seed Stories, which is an NGO coming. She's meeting with a few folks at 2 p.m. at Hunt Library. If you are interested in joining that group, come let me know after colloquium, and I'll give you the details. And I think that's all I've got right now. Oh, and Fred is going to be, did you talk about the food evolution yet? No.
Oh.
Fred is going to be doing a panel at the film screening of Food Evolution, which is a documentary on GMOs, over at Meredith College next week. Yes?
Thursday.
Next Thursday evening, and the details for that are on our website as well. And if you haven't seen the film yet, it's very interesting. So.
It is very interesting.
It's very interesting.
Great propaganda.
Any other announcements? Okay, well today's speaker is Nora Haenn, and she is associate professor in anthropology. And rather than going through sort of her CV for you guys, what I want to remind those of you who don't know Nora is what an amazing contributor she's been to our GES program. She's been involved in the IGERT from the beginning, I believe, right? Before I was here.
Version 2 of the proposal.
Version 2 of the proposal, okay. She helped to teach the kind of STS and social science and humanities course for the IGERT program. We were able to co-teach it together one year, which was fantastic. She was a participant and actually a leader on the field trip for the third cohort to go to Mexico, and her own expertise in Mexican culture and indigenous issues and the politics in Mexico and her Spanish-speaking ability were all amazing assets to our program. And importantly, she stayed involved as a faculty member who comes to colloquium, who continues to ask some of the most interesting and provocative questions of speakers. She brings a really different perspective to our conversation. That's part of what our community is about, is about fostering an environment where we can have very different kinds of expertise interacting in the same place. And so Nora is a really important part of that ongoing conversation in our community. So welcome.
It's really sweet, Jason. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I've been kicking around this talk for probably now like a year and a half, frankly, since November, the first week of November in 2016. You'll see here I have a co-author, Madeline Adelman, who didn't know she was a co-author or featured in this talk until 2 weeks ago, and we sat down and reviewed this with her. And so in the last years we've been talking about lobbying on behalf of whatever issue of interest to us. And right before spring break, we had folks send around request to women scientists, and also AAAS policy fellowships. And so it seems like a really good time to kind of think about what are the possible roles that we all could play. And so what I want to do is run you through some prominent roles that you're probably really familiar with, some critiques of those roles, and then I'm going to move us into a social justice framework, which I think gives way more flexibility. And the idea here is almost to take, it's going to come up again, an honest broker approach to roles. What are the multiple roles that you can do? What are the challenges in those roles? And this isn't meant to be dogmatic in any way. You're going to see like, oh, that role overlaps with that role, and I can combine that role with that role. And also, of course, where people are at in their lives changes with time, and so the roles people play at one point could change. Forgiveness in advance, I have a cold. Let's see. Didn't this work before, Jason?
It did.
All right. Okay. And so the premise here is that whether we act or not, we're having an effect on the world, right? Obviously, when we act, we have some kind of effect, but by not acting, we effectively support whatever the situation is around us. We effectively support the status quo, and so we'll want to keep that in mind. And I think it's really interesting that we in universities have access to really a number of roles. We really have way more opportunity than, say, I think people in the private sector or even citizens just working from home. And so these are kind of the four that I'm going to run through that are pretty well known before I move to the social movement framework. And so thought leaders is a phrase that people are using for people who encapsulate complex information into easily communicated and marketable big ideas. And this word marketable is going to be important in a minute. And the classic here are, of course, the TED Talks. TED Talks are about, let me tell you about my idea. I have this idea. I named it. And now I'm going to convince you that my named idea and the way I think about it is the way you should think about it. Public intellectuals, some people are using the phrase public scholar because they feel like the American public doesn't really like the word intellectual. They're working from a different perspective. They tend to be connection with that larger public, but they're also trying to retain that complexity. They're not trying to narrow things. If I go back to the thought leaders, that skill of encapsulating an idea into something that's easily digestible, that's really a skill required for most public forums. And especially where there's some kind of built-in audience that's expecting a certain narrative. You pull up a TED Talk, you kind of know how it's going to go, right? You don't know the content, but you know the flow. You go to an academic conference, you don't know the content, but you kind of have an expected idea of how it should go. So the ability to encapsulate information in those settings is super valuable. It connotes a specialization because you're pushing that one idea. Whereas public intellectuals tend to be generalists. They can insert themselves into these big picture conversations from multiple angles. And then, of course, lobbyists would be what we've considered an issue advocate, right? An issue advocate in the honest broker framework. A lot of you have read The Honest Broker. So lobbyists are attempting to express very specific goals attached to very specific areas of expertise. So, and trying to influence a very specific audience. So a little different from those thought leaders who are kind of pitching a narrow idea but broad, those public intellectuals who are these kinds of generalists who are trying to reach also multiple audiences, lobbyists much more narrow. And then of course honest brokers, which a lot of our students have read this book. This is a facilitative approach, and to be honest, in my digging around the internet for this, pretty hard to find examples of. Hard to find examples of a lot of these things, so I had to go to like book covers. But in the Q&A, I can tell you whose pictures did pop up in the Google search, because people in this room appeared in my Google search. And I think one of the reasons that this is receiving the least amount of attention is that we're really trained to take a stance one way or another. We're really trained to take a stance one way or another. And especially at the beginning of our careers where things are really insecure, we're really trained to become identified with an idea where we can make a claim, stake out that territory, you become known for it, and therefore when you put in that job application, you're going to be hired into that slot. So a lot of the way academia works is moving against the honest broker framework. All right, so here are some critiques of these positions. So some of the critiques of thought leaders is that for those of us who read The Kept University about universities' enthrallment to private sector money, thought leaders, this guy Sessions writing in the New Republic, argues that thought leaders are really kind of amenable to that dynamic because thought leaders are people who are selling a product. And universities nowadays love to have a faculty member with a marketable product. Public intellectuals. This is a mode that tends to be associated with skepticism and critique, which is also not super popular in small c conservative circles that are kind of interested in maintaining a kind of comfortable conversation. There's a lot of talk in research and on the internet whether or not this is in decline. Is intellectualism valued at all? And I would note here that different countries have different traditions of the public intellectual. So France, kind of famously, has lots of public intellectuals and is very tolerant of them, and in the United States we are less so. Okay, lobbyists, basically it opens you to that critique of being an advocate for something at the expense of the science. I think that's an idea we're all familiar with. And honest brokers, again, seems to be a less prevalent mode from what I can tell, at least from the internet and books. And I think one of the other reasons why it's less prevalent is that we tend to be an individualist society. And this is not about championing yourself as an individual. This is really about getting out of the way because you're giving people options and then letting them choose. All right, so now I want to move a little bit to Madeline Adelman, who is a great friend of mine, and I like to use her as a profile because I think the way she's working in academia busts these categories and it makes us think a little bit differently. Maddie is active in the LGBTQ community in the Phoenix area. So in her academic profile, she's teaching at Arizona State University's Justice Studies program and doing the usual academic stuff. She publishes on Safe Schools. She organizes this high-profile annual lecture hosted by Sonia Sotomayor, Anita Hill. Last week she was writing the letter of invitation in the hopes that Barack Obama will accept a letter of invitation. So she's really kind of operating at this level, and she can tell you all about how to host this kind of a high-profile figure. But in the community, what she did is she founded the Phoenix chapter of GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And she basically had 2 full-time jobs over the course of 13 years because she's running its day-to-day operations. And as part of that, she's lobbying state and local officials, but she's also conducting anti-bias trainings, both for GLSEN, but also for the Anti-Defamation League, where she's working through teachers in K through 12 schools. Facilitates town hall meetings. And this is just stunning for me. She actually attends meetings of local anti-LGBTQ groups and just kind of sits there and takes notes because she wants to know what they're talking about. But there's more, because at the national level, she's sitting on GLSEN's national board. She's conducting trainings at other universities that host international students. She's a board member of a national academic association, one of the subsections, and she's getting interviewed by media. And of course, there's all these things, you know, when you have a public profile like this, there's all these things that are going on behind the scenes that you can't really see. There's grant writing. She's training volunteers. She's mentoring youth. She coaches school board members and state legislators, often behind the scenes. So they'll call her up and say things like, one just called up and they said, oh, I want to write a bill that makes it illegal to have, what do they call it, where they try to educate a gay person to make them straight?
Gay version.
That's right. I want to make that illegal in Arizona. Not exactly a priority for her, but you know what? She's got a state legislator on the other side. She's got to hold his hand and walk him through that process. All right. So for me, it's like, is she a thought leader? Not really. She's all over the place. Is she a public intellectual scholar? Yeah, sort of, but you know, she's not doing what Neil deGrasse Tyson does. Is she a lobbyist? Yeah, but she does all these other things too. Is she an honest broker? Not exactly. She's got kind of an agenda she wants. She's not kind of offering people a lot of choices. If anything, she is going to restrain those choices and say, I think you should do this. And so basically, I think one of the reasons she gets to do this range is because she's using the social movement standpoint. And so we have to think about what social movements are. Basically, social movements have goals that they're going to pursue in pragmatic and flexible ways. And a real important point here, you know, the political scientists will tell us that today, in 2018 in the United States of America, we have this big bureaucratic government. And that means that as citizens, we tend to approach this big bureaucracy as consumers, that the state is supposed to deliver us services. Services like paved roads, clean air, clean water, regulation or not of GMOs. Social movement activists think a little bit differently. They don't think of themselves as consumers of the state. They say, we are the state. We are the state. The only problem is that we're not at the center of state activity. So social movement activists tend to think of themselves as people who are a little bit on the margin, who are trying to get into the center of the conversation. And social movements are a normal part of democracies, and so I just grabbed here a long list of social movements in history and some of the social movements we have with us today, just to give you a sense that these things are actually pretty commonplace, even if we don't name them as such. And so, drawing on this book right here, some of the roles from a social movement perspective include rebel, citizen, reformer, and change agent, and I'm going to go through these. And I want you to notice that the lobbyists, thought leaders, etc. can occupy any of these roles. And what I like about this perspective too is it gets you thinking about how you might be effective or ineffective in either of these roles. So I've really kind of condensed the bigger picture here to make it more digestible. So if you're interested, I definitely encourage you to look at the book. Okay, rebel role. See, I had to go for book covers. This one covers Galileo, Newton, and Oppenheimer. So the rebels are challenging some kind of status quo. They're educating the public about some kind of new social problem, maybe through direct action. They're critiquing power holders, usually thinking about the rebel as somebody in the vanguard of change. And these people can be very effective when they're putting issues in the public spotlight and on with policymakers' agendas, when they're empowering, when they feel exciting and courageous. But they can also be ineffective when they prove to be uncompromising, right? Or where their comfort zone is remaining on that lonely fringe instead of, making those compromises to move to the center. The citizen role. This was the only book I could find too. to talk about citizens' role, but it says 21st century citizen has to know something about genetic engineering. So the citizen role is going to highlight the topical fit with existing social values, will enlist support of trusted individuals, and the citizen is bringing legitimacy to the movement. And these folks can be effective when they're promoting commonly held values. In the United States, of course, things like democracy, freedom, and justice. When they promote acting in a disinterested way to foster common good. But they tend to become ineffective with over-reliance on official channels. You know, kind of assuming, oh, you know, things are in the process, it'll be taken care of, people are working on it, not to worry. Then the reformer role, and what I like about this picture is that this is actually like a middle school textbook. And when you get to genetic engineering being taught in this way in middle school, it's effectively become institutionalized. And reformers are basically insiders in the change they're trying to create. They don't have to be inside those institutions, but they often are. And so they're supervising the implementation of new standards in those institutions, and they're anticipating a lack of support. So they're figuring out how the change people want to make is viable in this institutional setting. But again, they can be both effective and ineffective. So they're effective when they're using those existing channels to get goals adopted into law, policy, and conventional wisdom, when they're using a variety of approaches, lobbying, legal measures, all kinds of things. And when they're mentoring and coaching, participating in networks. So they're not acting alone, they're building the networks they need to sustain that change within institutions. Tend to be ineffective when they promote minor reforms rather than meaningful change. You know, that was the best we could get now. And everybody else is like, that's so small. And also when they get prematurely comfortable with short-term achievements. Although somebody told me that prematurely and short-term was redundant in that sentence, and I should have removed it. Okay. Change agent. Vandana Shiva was the only person who popped up when I looked up the word change agent and genetic engineering. But the change agent acts at the tipping point where paradigms shift. And so they're catalyzing sustainable solutions. And these folks are effective, again, when they involve pre-existing groups. So what you're seeing here, this word networking is coming up over and over and over again. People working in collaboration, supporting long-term strategies, and promotes alternatives and flexibly responds to new challenges. But again, can be ineffective. You know, we all know folks who are isolated from the change they want to make, from the people who are affected by those changes. Also, something I think we are all attentive to in this room, can be effective when they're working in their disciplinary silos. Sorry, can be ineffective when working in those disciplinary silos. All right. And so again, these are not mutually exclusive. People can play 1, 2, 3, or all roles. We need multiple roles. If you have an idea that you want to advance a topic, you're going to need collaborators working at something from different angles. And also, I really like this, that you shift over time based on motivation, opportunity, time, treasure, and talent. Because I think especially when you're starting out, there's this pressure to like be the big thing, be the big thing. Well, you know, you can't be the big thing right out of the gate, especially if you're still thinking about taking care of the new baby, if you're thinking about paying that mortgage, if you're thinking about landing that first job to begin with. And these are just some general recommendations, which is to play to your strengths. So I have since learned that there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who basically play to their strengths and build on their strengths, and those like me who are like, I already did that, I'm bored, I need to do something new. And so you're constantly reinventing the wheel and feel like you're heading into headwinds. Play to your strengths, don't follow my path. Don't wait for the perfect answer or the perfect time for whatever is of interest to you. There is none. Just dive right in. There's an organization already working on the topic of interest to you in the way you want to work on it. And so dive right in, hang in there out there for like 5, 7 years. And then, you know, if at that time you say, nobody is doing this the way I think it should be done, then you can kind of launch your own group. Because there are many avenues of influence, so you really kind of can't go wrong. All right. And so I actually had pulled this slide together before all those emails went around. So you all know about Request a Woman Scientist. Diversesources.org is another internet site that is a kind of catalog of women in science. Helpareporter.com, so this is gender neutral if you guys want to just kind of get on the list, and then you become part of a stable where journalists can tap into. The Conversation, I don't know if y'all have checked out The Conversation. Megan's nodding yes. So this has become a popular place where academics are talking to journalists. Let's see, Connecting with Policy Makers, Scholar Strategy Network. I know Jennifer's already on this one, and I'm in the process of signing up. The AAAS, which we heard about last week, and then Maddie said, but also they could just go talk to the representatives. These are all kind of intermediary things, so people could just go talk to the representatives. And I'm sure there's a number of more things that I haven't mentioned here. I don't mean to narrow that at all, but this is kind of a working bibliography of some recent stuff. There's also plenty more out there, but these are kind of 2 new books back. It's come out just in the last couple of years. So I think this topic is one that we're going to be revisiting. Okay, that's all I have.
So plenty of time for questions. Thanks for.
Well, I'm hoping more a conversation. I mean, to think about what is it you want to do? How would you do it? And do you see yourself fitting in these roles, but maybe or maybe not? Yeah.
Do you think if Galileo or Newton were to have seen your presentation, they would identify themselves as rebels at the time?
Do rebels identify themselves as rebels at the time? What do you think?
Probably, maybe.
What do you think?
I don't know. That's what I was. That's what I started thinking about it when you went over there.
I think
Probably Galileo.
So I'll just add to the conversation. So my dissertation was about scientific dissent in agricultural biotechnology, and one of the things I discovered was a lot of scientists who basically became rebels didn't mean to. So they understood that they had become rebels, but when they started out just doing their science, they didn't intend to. And so part of it is the way that your work is responded to that I think drives you into some of these categories as well. It's not just your own choice.
Yeah, Megan?
So it feels a little bit like wearing different hats kind of thing. What are your thoughts to, once you are perceived in a certain way, how does that work? If Neil deGrasse Tyson suddenly doesn't want to be, I forget exactly what you used,
The public intellectual?
Public intellectual. How does that work? Is he forever typecast as a public intellectual?
That's interesting. You know what? I think this is interesting. That's the trade-off of fame too, right? And so a little bit we're encouraged to be famous, but there's flexibility in anonymity, isn't there? And that you can change your role a little bit more easily because now he's got his agent relying on him, right? He's got all these people expecting this persona. So I think fame is the consideration there more than actually how do you change roles. If you're famous as something, it becomes more challenging to change roles.
How do you see Honest Broker and its decline in light of kind of polarizing issues and kind of the way we've been headed as a culture in the United States?
Well, maybe Jason wants to step in here, but I don't think it was ever in decline. I think it was never a dominant mode of activity. And so it also means that we don't have a lot of good role models for that. And you would want to kind of think about carefully, well, how would I do this? You'd have to understand that where if you gave a TED Talk, everybody oh, she gave a TED Talk. I know who she is, she gives TED Talks. You would have to always be explaining, how you approach your material. And probably we would need a catchy phrase that works. Yeah.
And maybe one of the problems or challenges is that, a lot of, activity requires resources. And what excites people to get resources toward something as their own preferences. But the point of Honest Broker is to not push people toward a preference, but to clarify a problem, to help them make more informed decisions. I mean, who can get excited about that? Who's going to be motivated to say, I want to put my political capital or money capital or professional capital towards something where I don't even know what the outcome's going to be? I mean, in a sense, that's a little bit of what we're trying to do within GES, which means we're not funded in the way that some other initiatives are that have a much more clear political valence to them, even if they do some of the same activities that we do.
Okay, having not read the book all about honest brokers, I'm still finding this definition a little wibbly wobbly. So at what point does truth-telling begin to look like, at least, lobbying or something else that has a more biased and intentioned?
Yeah. So that's actually when I was running this by Maddie, she said, that's a subtle thing. Yeah, because so the idea of the honest broker is that you are going to lay out a series of options and then back off. That moment, do you subtly emphasize some options over others? Do you put forward 5 options, but actually you're happy with the 5 options you put forward and you keep off the table 1 or 2 that you actually don't want the person to choose? It's all in that moment there, and it's a very subtle situation.
And
it's somewhat related to that. In the Honest Broker, he talks about how the Honest Broker is often not a person, but rather a group. And that in some ways, as a person, it's so hard to be an honest broker, even not only in what you do, but in perception of you, because you're talking as an ego, right? And he talks about how things like the National Academy of Science things is aimed at being more of an honest broker, right? Because they're asked to answer a set of questions that society might have. But of course, he's also critical of that because of just what you said. It's so easy to fall into, okay, how many options do they put on the table and how did they frame it? You can't avoid that. But I thought it's interesting to think that one of the maybe reasons you don't find that is because it isn't an ego.
That's right. There is an ego there. You don't get as much, it's hard to build a career path by saying, I just let other people make the decision. Mike?
So I think this whole concept about an honest broker is, I don't know if it's more difficult in some disciplines than others, but disciplines like economics, where people are doing inherently quantitative analysis, measuring alternatives against each other, have a conclusion to the research generally that says one alternative is superior to the other based on some welfare analysis or cost benefit analysis, whatever you're doing, right? There is a quantitative, end to that research and your name's on the paper. So you have advocated an alternative through your research without sort of backing off, because I don't know, that's just sort of inherent to that type of research. And maybe every discipline has that, and I'm viewing that through an economic lens that's more familiar, but I feel like
that's kind of where I was going. If you think about a field and the question, like climate change or civil rights or whatever, and you think about somebody trying to put forth options, and if you're being honest and true, there's really only one option that is a good thing, and everything else is just not good.
Well, I'm thinking 2 things there. It's it brings in this question of ethics too, as well, right? So if ethically the options you have to put forward are narrowed because that's what you have, then I don't see any problem in saying, in order to speak with you honestly and ethically, I have to say this. These are the options that I think. I know there's other research out there, but ethically, I can't recommend them. That seems pretty honest to me. Separately, I'm remembering a recent conversation about whether or not people who are really smart say they're really smart. I think it was an article in The Atlantic of some journalist who had said, I have interviewed all these like Nobel Prize winners, and they would never say they were really smart, because they got into a level of learning where they knew how much they didn't know, they knew about the holes in the research, they knew the fragility of their research field well enough, because they were some of the most humble people he had interviewed. And so I think also in that sense, you know, as we go along in our research, we could say, okay, you know what, I'm finding this. You know, these are the challenges I encountered in coming up with this conclusion. These are some of the challenges in the field in general. And based on these challenges, I tend to support these kinds of findings because, you know, either I've seen the way this person works behind the scenes and they're a very careful worker, or, you know, I've run those kind of mathematical models myself and they seem robust in this way, although weak in this other way. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you can contextualize your findings and still maintain that sense of honesty.
And, I mean, I think to Mike's question about like, well, what about an economic analysis that spits out a number? I mean, it seems like one thing that you can do if you're in the role of honest brokering is to be transparent about the strength and weaknesses of the assumptions that went into it. So you're not just spitting out the answer, you're saying, if we take these assumptions as valid, then this is what you get. And you can also restate the question that your research answers to clarify that it doesn't actually answer this is what is the best option. It always answers a very much narrower question of, you know, under these conditions, if your goal is cost savings, then this option is your best one, but it reminds the decision maker or the committee of what, like, in what scope is your research living, and what is outside of that research, and what might disturb that research. So in that sense, you're still clarifying, even though the analysis that you did clarifies that for a certain set of values and conditions, this is the optimum answer.
And as you're saying that, I sort of recognizing that even if you have a certain answer, how whatever it is implemented, you know, is generally very important for who ends up reaping benefits of certain things as well. And that's a lot harder to answer through the type of research that I was talking about. So I agree.
Another hand up at the back.
Jason mentioned the answer to a question which I had on my mind, which is who exactly are you brokering for? And your answer was decision makers or committees or maybe the general public who might vote. But that sort of causes me to think if we put all this effort into perhaps contextualizing your own research, which may give you a particular conclusion, and trying very hard to eliminate your own bias, and then the final answer comes from a large group of people who vote on it subject to their biases, what's the point? How did it help for you to get rid of your bias and then run it through a bunch of other biases?
I don't think, so Pilkey's framework, I don't think is about creating honest brokers for general public discourse. I don't think that's what he was envisioning. I think he was envisioning contributing to processes of centralized decision making, whether that's in a kind of a political debate or whether that's within an agency, the kinds of like governmental decisions that get made. So I don't think it's meant to sort of diffuse wisdom across the public.
So same question though. I mean, if you're saying the expert who has an opinion is asked to contextualize it and hide perhaps his or her conclusion, and then someone else makes a decision based on a number of other factors which they are likely to apply bias to, and their bias not being expert bias, just some other bias or a combination of various experts' ability to hide their biases. It seems like you have reversed what you just did in emphasizing the role of honesty in the previous step.
Well, I think we can,
Go ahead, sorry.
we can think of multiple ways too. I mean, you know, the idea of complete neutrality is tough, but when you think about how do you talk about your research, what do? Right there, you've narrowed your research. If I asked you for conclusions based on your research. You're not giving me, you know, your dissertation proposal that gives the grand sweep of the field and locates your work within it. You're probably going to pick a very narrow frame of reference in which to explain it. So in the least, we can think about honest brokers, if you do want to come down and say, you know, this is the recommendation I would make, of expanding that frame of reference. Because often enough, I'm thinking about when I do watch TV, you know, there's kind of this straw man argument that gets, you know, shot down, and then, you know, the public intellectual comes in and saves the day with whatever idea. You know, even just expanding that frame of reference, I think, is, for me, progress in science advocacy. Jason, and yeah.
Oh, so you said something about being honest. It seemed to imply that if the scientist doesn't present his bias, that he's being dishonest to himself or something like that. Is that what
in the parlance of the past 30 minutes, not in general, but maybe in a sense of equivalence is more what I've drawn from how people describe the role of the honest broker.
So they're dishonest when they have a bias, but they're dishonest when they don't present that bias when they're presenting their data or their recommendation to a decision maker.
It sounds to me like in order to be an honest broker, the description I heard is that you need to mitigate whatever your conclusion is to a remarkable degree, either by not presenting it as your conclusion or heavily contextualizing it and saying, well, here's a bunch of other conclusions, or well, my work doesn't really speak fully to this, you should talk to someone else. So if that is the role of the honest broker, it sounds like you would fail at doing that if you were to just present your own conclusion more directly, in which case you seem to be unable to fulfill both of those functions. And if you don't present your conclusion directly, someone else is going to make a decision based on their own biases, which has minimum the same effect as you making a decision based on your biases.
And this whole concept of this honest broker and public administration has been looking at bureaucratic decision making for a long time. They have this term called the technocrat, right? That does it. The technocrat, you know, and so lots of people should say that these decision making processes, I should have somebody come and present me the data. They should be completely unbiased. And then that the decision maker who is elected by whoever should make the decision, right? So that's one branch of public administration. The other branch of public administration says you're absolutely crazy to think that happens because you're in politics, right? And whenever you run into an issue between two different value choices, politics is how those things get resolved, right? And so to think that you can have an unbiased decision-making process in a political system it just doesn't work. It's just not. It just doesn't work.
I come from an advocacy background, and so from an advocacy background, you're making usually an emotional argument, and part of the reason why you make an emotional argument when you're in an advocacy position is because people respond to emotional cues before they respond to intellectual cues, right? And so when you have these conversations where you've got so in today's context, for example, around the NRA and guns and those kinds of things, you've got an organization that is an advocacy organization that is making impassioned pleas, and they have a definite agenda. If you've got somebody else, not that it's being funded on federal level, but if you had, you know, scientists coming in and giving their perspective without adding the emotional context and having a specific perspective, it can be less persuasive to just get people to absorb that information.
Yeah.
Right? And so so in terms of the honest broker concept, what do you think is an effective way to get around that emotional pull that other people and organizations that are talking about the same issues have access to, that somebody who's coming at it from this perspective would not have access to?
So I would say I'm not totally convinced that emotional messaging works because I'm getting more involved in immigration rights And right now, the immigration rights community, not surprisingly, is incredibly angry and freaking out. And they're not getting meetings with policymakers. They just don't want to deal with this kind of angry, touchy group. I went to, partly I like Madeline's as a profile because I think the people doing the best messaging are the LGBTQ folks. I mean, just really as far as incredibly presentable, even-toned, on message as far as making sure whatever they're saying fits with widely shared values. So I'm not convinced that emotion is actually effective. If emotion were effective, then the NRA, I think, would have lost their battle years and years and years ago. And again, it might be that we just, there are many avenues of influence. And so it might be also for some issues, emotion is the way to go. And for other issues or other audiences, like, oh no, I don't want emotion, flat, neutral tone. So it might also be kind of depending and fluctuating over time.
Yeah, so in response to Jason's and maybe some other things, you know, I've heard this thing that science really matters when no one cares, right? You know, the idea that, you know, if you come up with your answer, economics or otherwise, you know, if you show that this one is more efficient or whatever, nobody really cares that much, well, we'll do that. But when you care, you know, if it's something that people don't want to just look at the funds or whatever it is, you have a stake in it, then the science goes out the door. And I think that somewhere in between there, and the role I see when I hear this honest broker, I think of it more as a trusted broker. You know, how do you gain trust in this whole sphere of all the stuff you're talking about? Somebody these days is looking for somebody you trust, and everybody is working to not let you trust anybody. Right? So how do you achieve that? And I think in the genetic engineering thing, that is what we're trying to do as GES Center, is listen to all voices, somehow develop our own more trusted voice, because we're sort of doing the LGBT thing of, you know, being, I don't know what the word would be. Neutral or rational, or at least, having balance kind of thing. So I think it's a really important question, because I don't know if, Jace, if you really feel like, indeed, it's politics, so it's just people's feelings. It's something to get at.
I think, if you talk to the hardcore policy analysis guys that come out of economics, or not out of economics, but like applied economists that do like in public policy and stuff like that, you ask them how much their policy brief has power on a decision maker, they'll probably tell you like next to like maybe 5%, right? Because most of the decision makers don't get the policy brief. It goes to a staff member, and then it filters through the staff member up into the decision maker, right? And so a lot of them will tell you that they don't have a lot of influence in that particular area, right?
But we do make decisions on which drugs get on the market and other things. I mean, we are doing those kinds of things.
I mean, when you talk about regulations and things like that, but when you're talking about potentially enacting laws and other things like that.
Okay, so that's, I guess, where maybe we differ is, because if you're talking about enacting laws, you know, to have a bathroom bill or something like that, or you know, but there are plenty of things where we probably.
Well, the other reason why I wanted to bring up this social movement perspective is that I think also as academics, I know that I was encouraged to be policy relevant when I was writing my dissertation, and I was, you know, frankly, so socially isolated from any policymaker toward whom I might be relevant. It was really a futile exercise. But I think that that's a common thing. I think it's still common, and we forget that there are a lot of other people on the planet. And a lot of time, policymakers are playing catch-up. You know, if we think about DIY biotech, they're playing catch-up. The DIY biotech people are in this social movement world. I've also kind of, I'm not thinking so much about, like, am I a reformer, am I a citizen, am I a rebel? I'm starting to think about audience size. Who's my audience? How big of an audience do I want? Because I remember sitting down saying to somebody, I said, he's like, I'm writing a book. I said, well, how big a book? He's like, well, you know, I'm hoping it'll sell like 20,000. He says, you don't want 20,000, you want 20 million. It's like, I do not want a book with 20 million sales. That takes over your life. I want to be able to go home and sleep at night. I don't want to get an email. So, you know, all of us have kind of time, treasure, talent, and energy. We should probably add to that. And so I've been thinking more specifically about who's my audience, how big of an audience do I think I personally can handle, and who are they? And so we have some easy ones, right? We have our students, we have our colleagues on campus, we have our home communities, so Jason's going to be giving the talk at the library. Those are kind of 3 very easy ones to start with. And then if somebody wants to be the next Neil deGrasse Tyson, great, but that would just be not the life for me, Yeah.
So I think you just answered a question that I've been wanting to bring up here, and that has to do with the complexities that one deals with when you occupy different roles, or perhaps the same role at different scales. Yeah. Where is your time and energy best spent? And I think you kind of just answered that.
Yeah, and will you be rewarded for that depending on what kind of job you have?
What? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to the NRA issue where emotional arguments aren't working, but I don't think facts are working either, because like you said, science matters when no one cares. People care greatly about their guns. And I'm not super familiar with the science, but I think the science shows that more guns equal more gun violence. So what do you do in those situations where it's an issue people are super passionate about? You can't bring emotions because they're inflammatory, but you can't bring science because people won't listen.
Or you have an answer.
Not an answer, but I'll just add to that. I think there's, lobbying efforts to keep science restricted.
There is.
Correct. Yeah. So, it's not necessarily that people don't look towards that. It's just deficient, maybe.
Jen has the answer.
No. I'd be rich if I did. Your observation reminds me of a talk I heard by Dan Collins, I think, where he was talking about the framing of the GMO debate, pro and con, and it seems like everyone has already decided and already picked, but his point that stuck with me was that not everyone has made up their decision, and so I'm not sure where this fits into this conversation, but I keep thinking about it. I thought about it when Eli was talking too. We're trying to get these honest brokers to present facts, and we're not going to be able to change the people's minds who have already made up their mind, but there are still large groups of people who haven't fallen on one side or another of the issues. So all of these types of people are important for reaching that segment.
I would also add that from a social movement perspective, I'm kind of interested in a way, people who you think are kind of these rebel firebrands are really not. They're really strategic. They're really strategic. So for those of you who accompanied us in Mexico, I don't know if you remember when we went to see these groups like Semillas de Vida, and they had been participating in CBOHEM and some of the national conversations, and then they just felt like, we're not making headway here. And so they left. And so they're really strategic about working with people who will work with them at that moment. I think they would walk right back into that national conversation as soon as they saw they had a counterpart willing to talk with them. But they're really strategic, so they're just not going to waste their time in some of the groups that you're talking about.
I think we're actually missing the point of the honest broker, and I think the reason is because we're so steeped in a kind of political expert culture that says that experts are supposed to show up and be neutral and provide answers that then guide the decision. Like, that's what we think about when we think about the role of experts in policymaking. And I think Pilkey's framework is trying to bust out of that by saying an honest broker is not just a more balanced, multidisciplinary answer giver. The honest broker is a different way of envisioning expertise. And the point is not to have a more defensible final recommendation. If you do that, you're an issue advocate. You're not an honest broker. Instead, what if the role of experts is to expand the scope of choices, to be creative in an environment that looks really partisan, where it looks like we just need experts to answer a single question? Or what if the role of experts is to clarify what are the sort of terms of debate and what is being sought, and how do differences in values connect with good information? That's a really different vision. And I just want to say one more thing about that is that there's a danger in Pilkey's framework too that it looks like a hierarchy, so that it looks like everybody should be aiming to be an honest broker. And he's really trying to say that's not the case. He's trying to make the argument that that framework should guide us for thinking about the different kinds of roles that are appropriate in different circumstances. So Patty, to your point before, you know, maybe we don't need an honest broker about gun violence right now, right? Maybe we need issue advocates. Maybe that's where experts need to be weighing in. Maybe we need pure scientists who are going to go off and do research about gun violence who are so disinterested and removed that in 20 years, when the debate is still going on, that research can be referenced in a way and brought to bear in a political argument. So yeah, I think I've said enough.
So, you know, we've danced around the lobbyist issue, but you know, that's a very powerful role, at least in this society. And it seems for those who are in areas that don't have those, that there's a distinct disadvantage. Would you like to comment on that around the view of science or balanced aspects or whatever the issue is with the lack of lobbyists? Anybody?
I guess my perspective, I'm a scientist, but why should people pay attention to me just because I'm a scientist, right? I mean, I'm coming at you, I've been trained, I have all this credentialing, right? But what makes me any better than a lobbyist that can come in and tell you a good story, and tell you a story about, you know, here's something, and then lots of times they'll tell you a story, and they're not scientists. Why? You know, so I deal with this myself. Why am I a scientist as a better authority to tell you to vote about something or not vote about something?
Well, maybe you don't have a better authority, but again, from a social movement perspective, you're a citizen. This is your government. These are your representatives. So they should be listening, no matter what.
Ren, I understand. I mean, I understand that I should say something, but we from science come from the viewpoint that what we say is like the best in certain circumstances, and that people don't listen to us, and so they're irrational when they don't listen to us. And so,
I don't sense that in this room, actually.
And I'm not saying that in this room, but a lot of the conversations that I've had with people outside of this room, I've sat in this room and had somebody tell me, well, I'm a scientist, and all these people are irrational because they think it
Right.
is.
So I guess what we can talk about there is effective and ineffective. And you can say, is that working for you? Has that been an effective approach for you to get your science across? All right, I promised you that I would tell you who I found. So when I look up genetic engineering and science and citizen, who do you think popped up in the pictures? Fred.
Oh.
Fred pops up.
With what? With what?
Genetic engineering and science, citizen. Citizen. And so then when I was looking up reformer, and I was like, okay, reformer, that's not getting me anything, but really this is about institutionalizing and working from within an institution. So I looked up genetic engineering and science institution, and who popped up? Jason. Yes, that's who popped up. So what I was hoping to do today is just kind of give you kind of a broader framework to thinking about what you might be doing. Also, when you are kind of making your own science advocacy path, you're going to obviously run into folks coming at it from other directions, and it can be very confusing. But if you have something you can work with, you can say, oh yeah, this person is kind of playing this role, or that role, or another role. And I, of course, always get mad. There was one GES talk last fall in the evening. I missed the colloquium, and it was basically given as a TED talk, and we were there. I was hopping mad at the end of it. I was hopping mad. And I was like, after this, I was like, now I know why. Because I was being preached at. And that wasn't what I wanted from a science talk. Yeah. Anyways, you can kind of think about who you're running into, what their perspective is, and you will know more than they do, because not a lot of people are thinking about this broader terrain. They're kind of getting on whatever path becomes available to them, and then becoming that thought leader, that public intellectual, that lobbyist, or whatever. You'll be able to make a more informed choice, I hope.
So Nora has done a great job of proving my introduction to be totally true. So please join me in thanking her. So next week is Dave Hawthorne, and be in touch with Fred if you want to meet separately with him.
And one more thing, I'm hoping that we'll be talking about teaching this semester and about the role of gender in being believed, because I have been looking at data on teaching evaluations, and I can only imagine that gender differences in teaching evaluations play into gender differences in the way we are believed or not as spokespersons for our research.